Adrian estudió el doctorado en Historia y Filosofía, Filosofía de la Ciencia en la Universidad de Cambridge, donde se graduó en 1992. Ha sido profesor en la Universidad de Kent, el Instituto de Tecnología de California y la Universidad de California en San Diego. Actualmente es profesor Alan Grant McLear en el Departamento de Historia de la Universidad de Chicago. Es autor, voy a decir los títulos traducidos al castellano porque es como una manifestación de voluntad de que queremos tenerlos en español. La naturaleza del libro, impresión y conocimiento en formación, publicado en Chicago en 1998. La piratería, la guerra de propiedad intelectual de Gutenberg a Gates, publicado en Chicago en 2009. Y La muerte de un pirata, la radio británica y la producción de la era de la información, publicado en Nueva York en 2010. En la actualidad trabaja en la industria que ha surgido en la era moderna para defender la economía de la información contra hackers, piratas, falsificadores y otros participantes irregulares. Él nos va a presentar una ponencia titulada ¿Por qué necesitamos una historia científica de la lectura? Dejo con ustedes al profesor Jones.
Gracias. Good morning, everybody. I want to start by thanking Rena for organising this. We had emails going back over maybe a year setting this up. To the staff of UNAM, the Instituto de Investigaciones, Bibliográficas, the Biblioteca Nacional, and the Hemeroteca Nacional. As you can tell probably from the way I said that, my Spanish is non-existent, and I apologise for that. I'm going to have to speak in English. I will try to do so as clearly as I can. My excuse is that when I was growing up, I grew up in the United Kingdom in a school system that didn't teach languages very well, and what languages it did teach were French and Latin, so I used to know French at least, but I was never taught Spanish, and then I became a scientist. And in the UK you specialise very early, and so I specialised in the sciences. And at that point I stopped being taught anything humane at all. I've spent years trying to recover from the kind of intellectual handicap that was. I want to start by I guess reminding you of the work that, at least for French speakers and to a great extent also for English speakers, marked the beginning of the history of the book as an enterprise. That was the work by Lucien Febvre and Henri-Jean Martin called L'apparition du livre, The Coming of the Book is how it's translated into English, which appeared in 1958 in Paris. That book really inaugurated the entire field. I don't know what the history of the field is in Spanish-speaking countries, but as I say, in French and English, it was really the Fondo Oregon. That work was originally meant to occupy the central place in an incredibly ambitious 100-volume series that would chart the whole history of human civilization from the Stone Age to modernity. Modernity, when it was originally designed, meant about 1900. This was a book that took a long time to be written and published. So Gutenberg's invention of printing in this grand positivist scheme was going to mark the midpoint, the point of transition between everything before the modern and the modern. No print, no modernity, you might say. Now, whatever one might think of that kind of unabashedly teleological scheme, its intellectual ambition, at least, seems to me to be something appealing. I like the idea of being as ambitious as possible in our historiographic enterprises. And that ambition also, incidentally, lay behind a statement that Febvre made in a letter to Martin as they were coming up with the scheme for the book, where he told Martin that whatever else it might turn out to be, L'apparition du livre, The Coming of the Book, must not be a history of the book, which I think is the most remarkable statement to launch a discipline that I've ever come across. What he was saying, I think, was that the degree of ambition that was written into that whole long series had to remain centre stage. That you have to attend to things like edition sizes, typography, and so forth, but you have to do that while keeping in mind the grand stakes of the whole enterprise. And I think it was actually an implicit criticism of English language historians and bibliographers and critical editors who tended to rather forget those grand stakes. Now, I think that the history of the book is, in the end, about these grand questions, or at least I think it should be. It deals with, for me, the most consequential ways in which knowledge itself is generated, circulated, debated, and acted upon. In other words, it's something like the infrastructure of history itself. Every branch of human society and culture since prehistory has depended upon the phenomena that we here study. In particular, this means for me that historians of the book need to take the sciences as a major subject, at least as much as they do literature or politics or religion or the law. Not least because the distinctive enterprise of modernity is science. So if the history of the book is to say meaningful things about modern civilization, then it needs to tackle scientific topics. There's common cause to be made here. There is an industry of the history of science, which I actually emerged out of. And like historians of the book, historians of science focus squarely on questions of how human cultures develop, consolidate themselves, and change. And they do that by investigating how people come to know what they know. One of the most elementary practices through which knowledge is made and remade in a continuous and, one hopes, never-ending process is reading. In fact, reading is one of the oldest and most ubiquitous of these practices. It long predates characteristic elements of modern intellectual culture like universities or laboratories or schools, and it remains central to all of those institutions. I think it's remarkable, for example, that if you look at histories of reading aloud, they often tend to focus on what we call popular culture. But in fact, one of the most remarkable sites for reading aloud in the modern world is the university. This is often what goes on in universities. When cultures of knowledge change in general, that change is often caused, shaped, manifested, and traced by acts of reading. And those acts are in turn accompanied and registered by innovations in the matter and form of reading materials, some of which may be overt, and some of which can be quite subtle unless you actually have experienced expertise in using those materials. It's because of this that what we tend to think of loosely as the same work, for example, Darwin's Origin of Species, can take on quite different connotations, can in fact become what you might call different works, corresponding to different formats in different places and contexts of use. An enterprise that focuses its attention on how all this has happened has the potential, I think, to reshape the themes, concepts, and chronologies of history itself. And of course, this is what the enterprise of the history of reading is. It uses evidence drawn from many kinds of sources, the material form of the book, to be sure, the layout of the page and things like that, but also primary source testimony about experiences, testimony about things like licensing practices by governments, to identify the shifting conventions by which records have been turned into knowledge and then action. The history of reading as it's emerged, though, I think has tended to opt for one of two understandable, but perhaps to some extent regrettable positions, one of which is too broad, as in notions like reading revolution, it's like a kind of holistic notion of what happened in the 18th century. Or the other is sometimes too specific, the multiplication of case studies, of which we now have many, to do with individual readers who happen to have left records. There are exceptions to these, of course, one of the greatest being the study of scholarly humanism, thinking of the work of people like Anne Blair and Anthony Grafton and their disciples. And actually, one that occurred to me last night, listening to the presentation about music, is that the history of music is actually a very good example of this too. There's a very interesting history to how impressions on the page of staves and notes have been read and acted upon by musical communities. And what's particularly interesting about that is that the whole early music movement is to some extent an exemplification of the history of the interaction of practice with the page. I want to sketch here, then, a proposal to create a history of scientific reading. We have nothing like this at present, but the centrality of the sciences to modernity make it an essential need if the history of reading is to realise its potential, and for that matter, I think if the history of the book is to realise its potential. And we need it also for a consequential reason today. Today, there are proposals afoot to revolutionise the sciences, also Booster's claim, by producing a revolution in reading. The future of science, and hence of culture to core, taken more broadly, lies, if these boosters are to be believed, in automating reading, in creating something called machine reading or literature mining. And these boosters are serious people. They include, for example, the American military. DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, has had a project to ferment machine reading algorithms. Machine reading allegedly allows the inevitable limits of human readers, limits of skill, discipline, perspective, education, and so forth, to be overcome. In a certain sense, it allows the limits of history to be overcome in its more ambitious forms. And it therefore should enable radical new kinds of questions to be asked, first in fields like biomedicine, but then by extension in fields like the humanities too, if you apply these kinds of things to massive online databases of historical records. And this isn't a merely abstract or utopian project. Machine reading is already happening in the biosciences. Biomedical research freely employs it. And in fact, Google's scanning project in the United States explicitly includes a commitment to it, a commitment that makes machine readers look like they're more important to the people from Mountain View than human readers. So it may be, at least according to this proposal, that we're at a historic transition point, the point when reading is finally separated from readers. And to get to grips with that, we need an authoritative understanding of how reading, in the sciences in particular, has developed in the past, more than we would just in the abstract. And we need that in order to tell what might be lost as well as what might be gained in an attempt to mechanize this skill. So what will a history of reading look like? What will its themes, its approaches, its chronologies be? It's early days to hazard views on these questions, but I want to try. There is a diverse body of work existing already, much of it not explicitly about issues of reading, that allows for some preliminary guesses. I'm not sure whether these names will mean anything to you, but people like Deborah Harkness working on the 16th and 17th century, Jan Galinsky on the 18th century, Jim Secord and Anne Secord on the 19th century, and David Kaiser, who's done brilliant work on things like the reading of physics diagrams in the 20th century. I'm going to take here a handful of instances that to some extent represent epochs. They represent something like a set of chronological stages that allow for a preliminary taxonomy and a chronology of the history of scientific reading based on these kinds of works. A key theme here is going to be that reading and readers are maybe thought of as forms of mediation and mediators, and that the history of scientific reading is a history of different institutions and practices of mediation in those ways. My examples are central to what have been called 3, and perhaps now 4, scientific revolutions, radical moments when the world of natural knowledge underwent transformation. Each of these centers on how reading practices made, but also unmade, forms of knowledge. The first is the Copernican revolution, which is associated with Galileo, so I'll talk about Galileo. The second is the revolution in experimental science and rational mechanics associated with Isaac Newton and experiments in the 17th century. The third is the revolution that created modern physics, to some extent, with James Clerk Maxwell in the 19th century. And the fourth, which I'll end with, is this alleged move towards automated reading in the biosciences and, by extension, everywhere else today. So, I want to begin by taking you back to Rome in the 17th century, the site for perhaps the most notorious reading of a book in the whole history of the sciences. This is the aged Florentine mathematician and philosopher Galileo Galilei, and the book in question is Galileo's Dialogue on the Two Great World Systems, as it's called in English, which appeared in 1632 and was the cause of the famous, notorious trial of Galileo, a moment that became a kind of canonical turning point in the history of the sciences and of religion. Now, one of the puzzling things about Galileo's fall is that it appeared over the wrong book. This is the frontispiece of the Dialogue on the Two Great World Systems. There's a real sense, though, in which an earlier book called the Essaya, or Il Saggiatore, was actually much more risky than the Dialogue. Pietro Redondi, an Italian historian of science, argued this a generation